republic such as we have supposedly in the United States, the primary purpose of government is to protect that which belongs to us as individuals. Protect us from the wrongdoings of government and to protect us from the wrongdoings of each other. The protection of private property rights, since private property is the foundation of liberty, is the key purpose of our government. And we see this scattered throughout the writings of our founding fathers. James Madison, for instance, basically said that the government is instituted to protect private property of every sort, as well as that which lies in the various rights of individuals. This being the end of government, that alone is a just government, which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. This is the basis of our Constitution, of our liberties, is private property rights. Why are they important? Fundamentally, if you look at the Soviet Union, and Michael Shaw basically talked about the Soviet system of being unresponsive to the people. But if we look, and they have no private property rights, if we look at the Soviet Union as the example of the antithesis as to what the United States founding fathers originally assumed, is that the Soviet method controlled its people, not through the KGB, although that was the ultimate control, but through the control or the lack of private property rights. Because if one person opposed the government, that person could be denied a place to live by the local commissar. He could be denied a place to work. He could be denied the ability to live because the private property rights was controlled by the government, not by the individual. And as a result, the control of the Soviet Union was not at the point of a gun, although that was ultimately their final control, but by controlling private property rights. The question before we get into why smart growth does not work is to define where does it come from? How come we have it? And I want to spend a little bit of time on this. Primarily, the first source comes from what is known as the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And United Nations is not part of the United Nations systems. It is an advisor to the United Nations and the international community at large. It also comes from non-governmental organizations, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy. Many of your socialist types of organizations are also fully involved in bringing us smart growth. And finally, the U.S. federal government. But how did they do this? In our last presentation by Michael Shaw, he listed all the things that the federal government is doing, the non-governmental organizations that are doing, and so forth. But how do they do it? Well, fundamentally, it comes out of the basic philosophy of the United Nations, which came out of Habitat 1 in Vancouver, May 31st through June 11th, 1976, where it says that land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, like we assume it is. It cannot be controlled by individuals. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and the concentration of wealth and contributes to social injustice. Going on, it says, if unchecked, it may become a major obstacle in the planning of development schemes. This is the philosophy of the United Nations, is that private property leads to tyranny. When we know, and the Founding Fathers knew, that private property was the essence of liberty. So we have an antithetical system. But this document actually goes on and says that the provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for the people can only be achieved if land is used in the interest of society as a whole. Public control of land use is therefore indispensable. In other words, according to the United Nations and the guiding philosophy that they have been operating under for almost 30 years now, is that private property belongs to the government to be used for their vision of social justice. and that individuals should not have the ability to actually own private land and use it for their own benefit. That is the guiding philosophy, and we need to understand this because much of the smart growth agenda, the entire environmental agenda, comes out of this philosophy in the United Nations. I call it the unholy trinity, made up of the United Nations itself, the World Resources Institute, the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, and the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This unholy trinity is responsible for almost all of the environmental goals that have been established in your backyard today. How can that be possible without the coordination between the federal agencies and the non-governmental organizations? How is it possible? Because the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, has as its membership the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and many, many other agencies, as well as the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, National Wildlife Federation, National Audubon, the National Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund. All of these are members of the IUCN, as well as the United Nations Environmental Program, the United Nations Development Program, UNESCO, and other United Nations organs. These meet on a regular basis behind closed doors, where the press is not allowed, to develop basically their strategy to implement control locally. For those of you who have been in the military, you begin to understand this is the classic flanking action of any military campaign, is to flank the enemy, cut them off from their resources, and defeat them. And this is what has been used for the last 30 years through changes in federal law and regulations, not by Congress, although Congress is complicit as well, but by the agencies themselves. At the same time, the same agenda is being fed to us by a multitude, a plethora of non-governmental organizations that come out from every direction possible, where it looks like this whole concept of smart growth, environmentalism, is coming to us from a host of different directions, when in fact it's all being planned out of a central organization known as the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. For instance, the IUCN, the World Resources Institute, and so forth, along with the federal agencies and non-government organizations, many, many years ago, 30 years ago, began to plan environmental law. It's not that we shouldn't protect the environment. We do have a stewardship obligation. It's our future. But there's two ways of actually protecting the environment. One is the Soviet method that you heard about with Michael Shaw, where you have groups that are not accountable to the citizenry making decisions for the citizens, bypassing the elected form of government, or you can do it through the constitutional mechanism of private property rights and other mechanisms where you're protecting the environment, protecting private property rights, protecting free trade, and a number of other things, accomplishing the same thing and probably much more effectively with the latter than the former. But about 30 years ago, they began to plan this strategy with the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Wetlands Regulations. Also, at the international level, the Kyoto Protocol, the Convention on Desertification, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and as we saw in our last speaker, Agenda 21. All of these then go into creating, in 1993-94, the President's Council on Sustainable Development, almost one-half of the membership of which were also members of the IUCN. They then begin to change federal law, existing federal law and regulation, including sustainable development as we see it today. You begin to see a process that's going on here.